Zalara had been part of the crew on this starship for only a few weeks, but she had already learned more than enough about human quirks to know that they were strange. Their customs were confusing, and their obsession with their tools seemed borderline obsessive. But nothing could have prepared her for what she walked in on tonight. She had simply come to return the missing component for Jack's latest repair job, an alien tool that had gotten misplaced in her quarters earlier. She was still a bit unfamiliar with human spaces, and she thought she could slip in quietly, leave the part, and be on her way. But as soon as the door slid open, Zalara froze. There he was, sprawled out across his bed, the human Jack. His chest was bare, his arms flung out like he had just fallen asleep mid-stretch. His face looked peaceful, which was unusual, considering how often he was muttering about something, usually his faulty equipment or the station's AI. But it wasn't his sleeping face that made Zalara stop in her tracks. It was the sight of him clutching something in his arms, holding it protectively against his bare chest. It took a moment for her to fully register what she was seeing, and when she did, her antennae twitched, and she swallowed hard. He was holding his tool. It wasn't just any tool. This was the tool, the one that Jack never let out of his sight, the one he carried around everywhere. The tool that seemed to be more precious than his actual life. She had seen it before, during his repair sessions, but she never thought much about it. Humans had a thing for tools. Apparently, they were vital to their survival. But now, the way he was clutching it so tightly, as though it were a beloved possession. Zalara's mind began to race. Was this some sort of human mating ritual? She had read about the different customs of the various species on board, but human mating behavior had never been fully detailed. The idea of them treating their tools as intimate companions wasn't entirely out of the question, right? Maybe the tool was more than just an object to them. Her heart skipped a beat as she watched him snore lightly, still clutching his multi-tool. His vulnerability stirred something in her, a mixture of confusion and something she couldn't quite place. She'd heard rumors that human relationships were more complicated than anyone gave them credit for, but this? This was far beyond what she had imagined. What was she supposed to do now? Was she supposed to leave him to his ritual, whatever it was? She took a cautious step toward the bed, glancing at his sleeping form to make sure he wasn't waking up. She was determined to return the part, but she didn't want to disturb him. Her mind raced. What if this was a sensitive moment? What if she interrupted something important? Maybe this was a private moment with his tool, some sacred time for bonding. She could feel her face heating up, unsure whether she should back away or approach. For all she knew, the multi-tool was a symbol of something deeply personal. Humans had strange ways of showing affection, after all. She had heard that they often gave their tools names. Did this one have a name? Did Jack name his tool? The thought sent a shiver down her spine, and she quickly stepped back, clenching the part she had been holding tighter. No, she couldn't be thinking like this. There was no way this was anything like that. He was just sleeping with his tool out, right? There had to be a logical explanation for all of this, but her mind wasn't cooperating. As she watched him shift in his sleep, the multi-tool still held tightly to his chest, she couldn't help but think there was more to this picture than she could comprehend. Zalara was beginning to feel the weight of her decision. Should she risk waking him up? What if she misunderstood everything? Maybe it wasn't what it seemed. Maybe she was just overthinking things, jumping to conclusions based on her own lack of understanding about human behavior. Still, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she had walked in on something more than just a moment of rest. In her head, she started running through every possible scenario, every explanation for why Jack would be in such an intimate embrace with his tool. But none of them seemed to make sense. She was overthinking, she told herself, trying to calm the fluttering anxiety building inside her. That's when it happened. In the stillness of the room, a soft muttering broke the silence. Jack shifted again, his voice barely a whisper in his sleep. "Keep it close, don't let it go." Zalara's breath caught in her throat. Her antennae shot up as she processed his words. Keep it close. He was talking about the tool. Or was he referring to something else entirely? Her mind spiraled, her thoughts making rapid leaps from one wild theory to another. This had to be some form of affection, something far deeper than just a tool. Maybe this was something sacred to humans. Something far more meaningful than she had ever realized. Before she could gather her thoughts and make a decision about how to proceed, she stepped back to leave the room quietly. But in her haste, she accidentally knocked a nearby object off the table, sending a loud clatter through the room. Zalara froze, heart racing as she realized what she had done. She quickly crouched down and ducked under the bed, hoping to avoid detection. Jack stirred, his eyes fluttering open as he rubbed his face, still half dazed from his sleep. Zalara held her breath, praying he wouldn't wake up fully. As Jack slowly sat up, still groggy, he began muttering again, his words barely intelligible. "What? Who's there?" Zalara's mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. Should she reveal herself? Should she apologize for intruding? The uncertainty gnawed at her. She had to make sure she wasn't crossing any human boundaries. But then again, who was to say what was acceptable? Humans were so unpredictable. Suddenly, a loud snore from Jack broke her thoughts, and she realized he had fallen back asleep. Zalara released a long breath, exhaling in relief. But as she stood, the mischievous glint in Jack's eyes met hers. "Did you think you could just take my tool?" he asked, his voice dripping with humor. Zalara blinked, eyes wide. "Your tool?" she stammered, feeling her face heat up even more. I didn't. I just..." Jack grinned. "Looks like you found it interesting," he teased. "Should I be worried?" Zalara stood frozen in place, her heart racing at 1,000,000 miles per hour. Jack's grin was both teasing and mischievous, making her feel like she had just been caught in a bizarre, human game that she didn't know the rules to. She stammered, her mind scrambling for a coherent response. I didn't mean to. I was just trying to return the..." Jack interrupted, his eyes sparkling with amusement. "Return the tool, huh?" He let out a low chuckle, leaning back slightly as he regarded her with an almost knowing expression. "You've got a funny way of doing it." Zalara felt her face heat up again, unsure how to react. She was sure Jack hadn't understood the gravity of the situation. After all, to him, the tool was just a simple object. But for her, the whole thing felt like an alien encounter of an entirely different kind. She had no idea how to navigate this awkwardness. "Look," Jack continued, leaning forward slightly and motioning to the multi-tool still clutched against his chest. "This is just a tool, all right? It's not some sacred thing or, well, okay, maybe it's a little sacred to me, but..." His voice trailed off as he caught sight of her confused expression. Zalara blinked, trying to process his words. "Sacred? Yeah, you know," he said, his grin turning slightly more sincere. "I've had this thing for a long time. It's helped me fix a lot of stuff. I guess it's kind of like a companion? But not in the way you're thinking." Zalara's mind scrambled for an explanation. Companion? She couldn't quite figure it out. She thought of humans as a species of practical beings. Emotional attachment to tools wasn't exactly something she had anticipated. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something. But his words hung in the air, and she had to make sense of them before this entire situation spiraled completely out of control. "So you sleep with it?" she asked cautiously, unsure if she was crossing a line. She hadn't meant for it to sound as suggestive as it did, but the words had slipped out before she could stop them. Jack's laughter came like a wave, and Zalara winced slightly, wondering if she had misinterpreted things again. He leaned back on the bed, his hands behind his head as he stretched, clearly amused by her question. "Yeah, well, sometimes," he said casually. "When I've been working on a huge project, it's kinda like a safety net. Helps me feel like I'm still in control." Zalara blinked. "In control? Of what?" Jack chuckled again, clearly enjoying her confusion. "You know, life. Fixing things. Making sure everything works properly. The multi-tool's been with me through a lot. It's just a comfort, you know?" He tilted his head, looking at her curiously. Don't tell me you've never had something you can't sleep without? Zilara thought for a moment. She had never considered such a thing. She'd been raised with a deep respect for functionality, not emotional attachment to objects. Tools were tools. They were meant to serve a purpose, not to provide comfort. But Jack's perspective was making her rethink everything she thought she knew about human behavior. I suppose not, she admitted, her voice quieter now as she processed his words. She felt like she was walking on thin ice, but she couldn't deny that her curiosity was piqued. So, it's not special in any other way? She asked, the question leaving her lips before she could fully consider the implications. Jack raised an eyebrow, clearly sensing her hesitation. I think you're still a little lost on this, aren't you? He asked, his voice lighter now, as though he were trying to make her feel more comfortable. It's just a tool, Zilara. It's not like I'm emotionally attached to it in a weird way. It's just my thing. You know? Zilara's eyes darted to the multi-tool once more, then back to Jack. She was trying to process his words, but everything about the situation was still a little baffling. A human comforting himself with a tool. It was almost laughable. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that perhaps it wasn't as ridiculous as it seemed. Okay, I think I get it now, she said slowly, still unsure but trying to make sense of it all. It's just, I didn't know humans treated their tools like that. I mean, I thought it was just something you use for work, not as some kind of personal attachment. Jack nodded, sitting up a bit straighter. I get it, he said with a smile. Most people probably wouldn't get it, but hey, if it works for me, then who's to say it's wrong? Zilara couldn't help but grin a little, the tension between them starting to dissolve. So, you really don't think it's special? Jack shrugged. Well, I wouldn't say that, he said. It's special to me, sure. But not in the way you're thinking. Zilara nodded, still processing, but feeling more at ease now. There was something oddly endearing about Jack's casual approach to the whole situation. Humans were, after all, a strange breed. But now that she understood a little more about their obsession with tools, she was starting to feel more comfortable in her own skin around him. I guess I'm just still learning about human customs, she said with a shrug, trying to hide the slight awkwardness in her voice. It's very different from my own culture. Jack smiled warmly. I get that. Believe me, the first time I came across your species, I was just as confused. But we all get used to things eventually. There was a moment of silence, and for a split second, Zilara felt like maybe she wasn't the only one out of her depth. She had assumed that human behavior would be straightforward, but Jack's easygoing attitude and casual explanations had made her feel like she was in over her head. And yet, for some strange reason, that made her feel a little closer to him. Not just because of his humor, but because of how comfortably he seemed to deal with everything. Okay, well, she said, taking a deep breath. I guess I'll leave you to whatever it is you do with your tool. Her words came out in a rush, and she instantly regretted them, feeling her face turn even redder. But Jack just laughed, clearly finding her discomfort amusing. You mean my multi-tool? He teased, winking at her. Don't worry, I'm not planning on taking it to bed with me tonight. Zilara gave him a nervous smile, her heart still racing from the entire exchange. Good to know, she muttered under her breath. Relax, Zilara, Jack said, his voice light and reassuring. I'm not going to bite. But if you ever need anything, don't be afraid to ask. His grin softened, and there was a brief moment of understanding between them. Zilara hesitated for a second, then nodded, her thoughts still spinning from the unexpected turn of events. Thanks, Jack, she said quietly. I'll keep that in mind. Zilara stood in front of the door, staring at the control panel in frustration. It had malfunctioned. Again. She had tried everything she could think of, but it was stuck, locked in place. She couldn't leave the room, and the human engineer Jack was still in there with her. The last thing she wanted was to be stuck in a tiny room with him after what had just happened. The awkwardness from their previous conversation hung in the air, thick and uncomfortable. She had learned about the tool, about Jack's strange attachment to it, and now she was facing a situation where she was forced to remain with him in the same confined space. Zalara's antennae twitched nervously as she turned back to Jack, who had been quiet for a moment. He was sitting on his bed, watching her as she fidgeted with the control panel. "Well, this is a fine mess," Jack said, breaking the silence with a chuckle. "I knew I shouldn't have trusted the automated systems. They always mess up when you least expect it." Zalara let out a huff of frustration, tapping at the controls again. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. "Why does this always happen when I'm alone with you?" Jack raised an eyebrow. "Hey, don't blame me. I didn't design the ship. But it looks like we're stuck here until we figure this out." Zalara shot him a look. "I can't believe this is happening. Why couldn't the door just open normally like it's supposed to?" She glanced around the room, as if expecting some sort of miraculous solution to appear. "This is so typical. I never get these situations right." "Hey," Jack said, standing up and walking over to her. "Don't worry. We'll figure it out. Just need to use your head, like any good engineer would." Zalara shot him a look. "I'm an engineer, not a magician." Jack smiled. "Well, I'll take your word for it. But come on, we've got this. Maybe you just need to give it a little human touch." Zalara frowned, unsure of what he meant. "Human touch?" "Yeah," Jack said, moving closer. "Sometimes the right kind of pressure works wonders on stubborn systems. I've had to fix things this way before." He was grinning now, clearly enjoying her confusion. Zalara's brow furrowed in suspicion. "Pressure? What kind of pressure are you talking about?" Jack shrugged nonchalantly, then placed a hand gently on the control panel. Zalara's eyes followed his every move. "You've got to use just the right amount of force, like this." He pressed down harder on the panel, his fingers moving in a familiar, confident motion. Zalara was about to ask what exactly he meant by pressure, but before she could form the words, the door suddenly clicked open. Both of them froze. Jack, looking a little smug, gave a small, satisfied nod. "See?" he said with a half grin. "Just needed a little bit of force." Zalara blinked, her eyes darting back and forth between him and the now open door. That actually worked?" Jack shrugged again. "Sometimes things just need a little push." He turned toward the door, motioning for her to step through. "Ladies first?" Zalara stared at the open door for a long moment before glancing back at him. She was still processing what had just happened. It wasn't just the door that had opened, in a way she didn't expect, it was also the way Jack seemed so confident, so at ease. She felt like he was always one step ahead of her, and yet in a way that didn't make her feel stupid. It was frustrating and oddly comforting at the same time. "Thanks," Zalara muttered, stepping out of the room, but Jack didn't follow immediately. He lingered behind, giving her a look that made her heart skip a beat. "You sure you don't need a hand with anything else?" Jack asked, his voice softer than before. Zalara paused, caught off guard by the question. She hadn't expected him to offer. No. I think I'm good," she replied quickly, her antennae twitching as her nerves flared up again. "Really, you've done enough for today." Jack stepped closer, a mischievous glint in his eye. All right. Just making sure. But if you ever need help with something else, you've got my number." Zalara's heart raced. She knew what he meant. There was something in his voice that made the offer sound more personal than professional. And that wasn't lost on her. But at the same time, she wasn't sure if she could handle being so open. They had just had that awkward encounter earlier with the tool, and now here they were, stuck in an equally weird situation, with Jack being unreasonably charming and smooth. "I'll keep that in mind," she muttered, trying to hide the nervous smile tugging at her lips. Jack winked. "Good. Don't forget." Zalara stepped out into the hallway, quickly turning away to mask her flustered expression. She wasn't sure what it was about him that made her feel so flustered. Maybe it was his casual confidence, or the way he handled everything with such ease. Or maybe it was just the fact that he wasn't making things awkward with her, unlike everyone else she had met. But it wasn't just that. There was something about Jack's laid-back attitude that intrigued her, something that made her want to know more, to understand why he acted the way he did. He was so different from anyone she had met before, so human, so relaxed. It was honestly a little unnerving. As Zilara walked down the hallway, she found herself thinking about their interaction, replaying it in her head over and over again. She had never felt this way before, like someone had gotten under her skin in a way she couldn't explain. She tried to shake the feeling off, but it lingered, a knot of curiosity and something more, something deeper. Jack's voice called after her, breaking her thoughts. "Hey, Zilara!" She turned around, blinking. "Yes? You left your tool in there," he said, holding up the part she had been trying to return to him earlier. "I thought I'd keep it safe for you. You know, just in case you need it again." Zilara stared at him for a moment, realizing that once again, Jack had just caught her completely off guard. "Thanks," she said quietly, reaching out to take the part from him. He gave her a friendly smile, his eyes twinkling with humor. "Anytime." As Zilara walked away, her thoughts were a whirlwind. She wasn't sure what to make of her growing attraction to Jack, but one thing was for sure, she wasn't going to forget this moment anytime soon. She could only hope that the next time they crossed paths, the situation wouldn't be nearly as complicated. But with him, who knew? Zilara's footsteps echoed down the hall as she made her way to the engineering bay. The entire experience in Jack's quarters replayed in her mind like a never-ending loop. She hadn't expected to find herself in that position, and she certainly hadn't expected Jack to handle it with such casual ease. She could still hear his teasing voice in her head, see his mischievous smile. Every time she thought she had a handle on things, Jack had a way of flipping the script and leaving her unsure of everything she thought she knew. She pushed open the door to the engineering bay and stepped inside. The quiet hum of the station's systems surrounded her, but she couldn't focus on it. Her mind kept drifting back to Jack, his grin, his teasing words. She cursed herself for letting her thoughts wander like that. She had a job to do, and she couldn't afford to be distracted by, well, him. It wasn't that she didn't find him attractive. She did. There was something undeniably appealing about the way he carried himself, his easy confidence, his ability to make even the most awkward situations feel almost comfortable. But that was the problem, wasn't it? She wasn't supposed to feel comfortable around him. She was supposed to maintain professionalism. And yet, every time they crossed paths, she felt the tension, the pull, as though they were walking a fine line between friendship and something more. Zilara walked over to the workbench, trying to shake off the growing frustration building inside her. She focused on the tools in front of her, forcing her mind back into work mode. She was just about to begin calibrating a component when she heard the door open behind her. "Busy?" Zilara didn't need to turn around to recognize the voice. "Jack." She tensed slightly, but quickly regained her composure. "Just trying to finish some diagnostics," she replied, her voice more clipped than she intended. Jack chuckled, the sound warm and easy. "You're always working. You need to take a break sometime." "I'm fine," Zilara replied, not looking up from her work. "I'm just focused." Jack didn't move at first, but she could feel his presence just behind her. She had a sudden awareness of how close he was, of how easy it would be for him to step into her space and break the delicate tension that had been building between them. She didn't know why it bothered her so much. It wasn't like they hadn't spent time together before. This was just a ship, after all, with limited space. But for some reason, now, with him standing there, she felt more aware of the unspoken pull between them than ever. Finally, Jack moved. She heard his footsteps approach the workbench, and before she could react, he was standing beside her, his presence undeniable. Zilara couldn't ignore the subtle heat that surged through her at the proximity. She cleared her throat and tried to focus on the task at hand. "You sure you're not just trying to avoid me?" Jack asked casually, leaning in to look at the work she was doing. Zilara didn't answer immediately, unsure how to respond. I'm not avoiding you, she said, her voice tight. I just have things to do. Jack raised an eyebrow. Uh-huh. So, it's not that you're trying to avoid me specifically? His tone was playful, and he didn't seem to be taking her seriously. Zalara glanced at him quickly, her frustration bubbling over. I'm not avoiding you. I need to finish this. Jack smiled knowingly. Right. But what if I told you you're really good at avoiding things? You don't seem to be able to look me in the eye when we talk. His voice was teasing, but there was an underlying sincerity to it that made Zalara's stomach do a strange flip. Zalara didn't know how to respond to that. She had noticed it too, how hard it was to meet his eyes, how every time she was around him, the air seemed to thicken. It wasn't something she had control over. Every time she thought she had figured out how to behave around him, he found a way to shake things up. I'm not avoiding anything, Zalara said again, her voice firmer this time, though it lacked the confidence she wished it had. I just have a lot on my mind. Jack's smile faded, but only slightly. You don't have to hide, you know. Zalara's pulse quickened at the way his voice softened. She hadn't expected him to be so direct, so honest. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Jack placed a hand lightly on the edge of the workbench, leaning in a little closer. She could feel the space between them shrink, and her heart thudded in her chest. It wasn't just the proximity. It was the way he was looking at her, the way he seemed to see through her walls. You don't have to pretend like you're not interested, Jack said quietly, his voice smooth, almost gentle. Zalara swallowed hard, caught between confusion and something else entirely. What was he saying? Was he reading her mind? Had she been that obvious? Her heart raced, but she couldn't seem to find the words to respond. I'm not pretending, she said finally, though the words felt foreign coming out of her mouth. She wasn't sure if she meant them, or if she was just trying to cover up the way her body was betraying her. Her nerves were a mess, and her thoughts were in disarray. But Jack wasn't giving her any room to retreat. He was too close, and everything inside her was screaming for her to either run or stay. Jack didn't say anything for a moment, his eyes locked on hers, studying her. His expression shifted, no longer playful, but something softer, more serious. He stepped back slightly, giving her some space, but not enough to erase the tension. Well, just know this, he said, his voice quieter now. I'm not going anywhere. Zalara stared at him, her thoughts in turmoil. She didn't know what he meant, but she could feel the weight of his words in her chest. There was something about him, something about the way he made her feel that she couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just attraction. It was deeper, more complicated. She forced herself to look away, breaking the contact. I need to finish this, she said again, her voice slightly steadier than before. She couldn't keep playing this game. She had to focus. She had to get back to work. Jack didn't press the issue. He stepped back, raising his hands in mock surrender. All right. I'll leave you to it. But don't forget, I'm here if you ever need a break. You don't have to be so serious all the time. Zalara nodded without looking at him, focusing on the task in front of her, but his words lingered in her mind, tugging at her in a way she couldn't escape. As Jack walked away, Zalara felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. She wasn't ready to face whatever was building between them. Not yet. But for some reason, she wasn't sure how long she could keep ignoring it. She turned back to her work, but her thoughts were no longer on the diagnostics. Instead, they were filled with Jack's voice, his smile, and the undeniable pull between them that she wasn't sure how to handle.